Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Network Capital podcast. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Mehek. With me are Christina and Disha. We're from the International Innovation Corps, which is a social impact fellowship for young professionals based out of the University of Chicago. Christina, Disha, why don't you guys introduce yourselves and talk about the program a little more?
Hi, I'm Disha. I work as an engagement manager for the education and gender projects with the IIC.
And I'm Christina. I work as a project associate with the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, which we also refer to as MOHFW, working directly on the digital health strategy there.
Would you like to, Disha, would you like to talk more about what the IIC is? What does it entail? What is the journey like for a fellow?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Mehek, IIC is a social impact fellowship program, but what's very unique about the year that a person spends at the IIC is that you essentially get to work directly with a government partner on the ground, and you interact with everybody in the system, right from principal secretary and state project director to last mile implementers and people who are on the ground. And what's even important is where this comes into play is IIC has a twofold mission, which is to create scalable and sustainable reform with government, but also to create the next generation of young leaders in the space, which is by giving them exposure to complex systems like the government, but also to provide support throughout the year, which comes from the management team, which is people like me who will work with different project teams on making sure that the ideas and the solutions that we're implementing are well thought out, are well structured, and make sense for the government. We are broadly sector agnostic, but there are certain specific areas that IIC does have projects in, which is education, health, gender. We also have upcoming projects in data and good governance. So there are a lot of domains that a person can get access to once they're on the fellowship program.
So Christina, Disha spoke about the twofold mission. Since you work at the ministry, what is your perspective on how does a fellow add value to the existing system? What is it that a fellow contributes, and how is that journey in regard to both, one, creating scalable solutions, to your own personal professional growth at the end of the fellowship?
Right. I think it's very interesting how our project has panned out, and this is a perspective that I'm building while I work with the Ministry of Health as I go ahead. One is what role does a fellow play in this ecosystem that we're put into? I'd like to highlight the diversity of the teams that comes in. One understanding that came very early on in the application process, and then when I joined the team, is that the teams, there's not going to be a one solution fits all kind of mold. The role that IIC plays in any given ecosystem is going to depend on the context, the conditions, and the kind of stakeholders that we work with. So my project with the Ministry of Health requires us to work at a rather macro level, working with a specific joint secretary and advising him on the digital health strategy and the implementation of it with smaller stakeholders. But many other projects, including the NIUA project that is a current project with the IIC, involves working with an organization like the NHA and advising on public-private collaboration and ecosystem conditions that enable this through a very implementation platform that's going to leverage some success factors for collaboration to happen, and fellows on that project are overseeing direct implementation of how this can happen.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting and what's also slightly different in my experience, Christina, and that's broadly because my teams and we worked in Rajasthan with the State Department.
Yeah.
The project was much more implementation focused. So, I mean, yes, there is a broad strategy, you co-created with your government stakeholders, but there was also a very strong implementation lens. So essentially, and that's true across most IIC projects, right? That there is going to be slight differences, but at the end of the day, we're trying to create reforms that stick.
Yeah.
We're trying to build capacity of different stakeholders within the system, and we're trying to do it in a way where the fellowship year essentially turns out to be a great learning year for us and our teams. And I know personally for me the learning has been great. I moved from a project associate position to a project lead, and then eventually now I'm an engagement manager, and it's very interesting to see how everybody's personal journeys are very different, but essentially people leave the fellowship or stay on for a second year knowing certain things and developing certain skill sets within themselves. So stakeholder management is something that I personally feel I developed a lot and very strongly, because you interact with funders, you interact with government stakeholders, and you interact with various implementing organizations to build synergies. Like I think you mentioned in one of our conversations earlier, IIC is an ecosystem enabler, and we try to bring people together essentially so that organizations are not working in silos, and we're collectively mobilizing everyone's efforts towards one common goal.
Also, another thing I feel would be very interesting for our listeners to know is that, again, Christina was mentioning this earlier, that IIC has carved a niche for itself to mold itself to the different challenges that exist across sectors. So, there is no one-size-fits-all. How does this benefit a fellow who joins the fellowship and goes to the various ministries, social enterprises to work, and how is IIC's management supporting them in this journey?
That's a very fun question. So, can I take a go at it? One is, I'll tell you about how we've maneuvered this in my context. As is a team that till most recently had a public health specialist, a doctor, has a lawyer, has an engineer, and has me working, who has experience in working prior in grassroots social impact, in education, not health. So it was, and is still a very interesting process to look at how these different skills come together and problem solve in a very, very bureaucratic structure. So we've constantly had to reassess whose skill we need to leverage to get a certain outcome and drive it forward, and what skills we need to bring which don't exist in the team currently, and bring it from externally and have it represented in our team in order to drive our credibility with our government stakeholder and drive that certain outcome. So I'm sure, Disha, you would like to highlight in the process that a fellow follows in that 1 year period where there's a scoping period, there's a design phase, and then there's really testing your solutions, going on ground, seeing if this is going to be a sustainable solution. Because even though the fellowship is a year's worth of learning for the person taking it up, there's a lot more to think about in terms of what are sustainable systems that we leave in our wake for fellows to come, for systems that adopt these solutions, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue for me, because everything that you kind of hinted at is what the management wants to work on with the fellows. We want to work, and 3 broad areas I think that we would look at which are critical. One is stakeholder management, which is what you mentioned, like using the right levers for the right outcomes, and being like, okay, these are the right people in the system that we need to speak to, but also what are some existing mechanisms in the system that we can leverage, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. The second is program management, which is to realize that, there are too many things to be done in any system when you go there, and everything needs to be fixed. And usually you're pulled in all directions. So what is the 80% what is the 20% that we do, which leads to 80% of gains for the project and from a sustainable point of view? And you might realize that capacity building is key in one project, and another project So stakeholder management, program management, and team management are 3 critical pieces that the management would work on. We would have regular feedback mechanisms, weekly check-ins and so on. So there are structures within the IIC that support fellows with ad hoc problem solving, but also larger level strategy. So you mentioned the scoping phase, which is something that all our projects go through, which is an initial sort of month or so of doing diagnostics, scoping out what the project would look like for the year in a much more granular way than you start off with. Like, there is a certain understanding when you go into a department and say, okay, I'm going to work on say education, and then you break it down and be like, okay, we have 4 members in the team, we have these work streams, and we're going to work throughout the year with these timelines and aim to get certain outcomes. So it's a very sort of structured process. But what is interesting is the sustainability and the capacity building point of view that you mentioned, which I keep coming back to. So IIC was in Rajasthan for 4 years, and of those 4 years, I was there personally for 2 years. And what is interesting is that one of our flagship projects with the government was creating a portal called Gyan Sankalp, which is a CSR portal with the Department of Education. And what we did was essentially not just create a portal and leave it at that. We created structures within the department of approvals, how will the money reach the school, how transparent is it, creating committees, creating district level accountability for it. And what we essentially ended up seeing is that in 2 years the portal raised nearly 100 crores. And what is even better is that it continues to run, and IIC has moved out of Rajasthan now. We're in 3 other states working on education. But the biggest success has been that a government continues to run a certain intervention even when you move out of it.
So Christina, would you like to highlight some of the challenges that you faced during your project, during the course of the fellowship?
Yes, I think a lot has been spoken about the perks of working in a public system, having access and exposure to macro level strategies, decision making, how all of that happens. And I think IC teams across the board spend a lot of time in stakeholder management, and that's a part and parcel of the process of working in such an ecosystem. You end up having to give a lot of your time, energy, resource to building credibility with the stakeholders, which can be taxing, and it can involve you doing a lot of tasks which might not seem in the direct scope of your work, but in the long term helps you build trust and credibility with your stakeholder to a very large extent. In the sense of once you manage to reach a certain level of trust and credibility with your stakeholder, it means speedier decision making in your favor, more face time with that specific stakeholder, which is very often taken for granted in a public setup. And more than anything else, you find levers of the system rooting for you to reach a certain outcome. So in our context of digital health, this means that there were more smaller assignments, tasks, sort of decisions made in the background that we wouldn't have been aware of previously, but now having built that certain level of trust and credibility, we were privy to those decisions, we were privy to certain projects happening in the background that we wouldn't have had our eyes on otherwise. So that's part and parcel, I feel, and you find your very team independent way of dealing with it. But it's going to be an important consideration you make as you decide to take on the fellowship and work in a specific public ecosystem.
Right. So throughout the course of this podcast, we've spoken about the program, the journey, management oversight, training, what can you expect as a fellow. What about post-fellowship? What happens? What are the fellows doing after they finish the fellowship? Where do they work? Disha, would you want to highlight that?
I think that's a great question, because when I came in as a fellow as well, that was on my mind. And I remember I spoke to fellows who were on projects at that point. And as management, I now know that over 75% of our fellows will continue to stay in the social sector in different roles. So that will be, either they'll move to another development consultancy, or they'll move to a foundation, or they will choose to go for their masters in public policy. Some of our fellows have even gone to business schools. So it's essentially it's between pursuing a postgraduate opportunity, or sticking with the space, but moving across the board from funding or implementation, or more of development consulting. But essentially what I think everybody leaves the fellowship having gained this core skill set of navigating different avenues in the development sector, and it essentially prepares you for a host of opportunities that you can take on later. And I think both the UChicago network, as well as the management support that you get when you're here, as well as obviously the experience that you have on ground, kind of builds to whatever you choose to do next, and a lot of options open up. So
perfect. On that note, I would want to quickly also talk about the application process and how the fellows selected. The applications are actually open right now. For the 2020-21 cohort, IIC is accepting applications till the 4th of November 2019. You can go to our website, iic.uchicago.edu, to get all the information. The application process is pretty straightforward. There are 3 documents that you need to upload. The first is your resume. The second is a cover letter where you talk about what inspires you, motivates you to join the IIC. I would recommend you go through the website, read through our projects, and try to help us understand how will you add value in an IIC team, add value to the diversity that we seek for, and what is it that you bring to the table which will then help solve the challenges that we're working on.
And I think before we close this, what's going to be a critical piece of your application is going to be the innovation proposal.
The innovation proposal, yes.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten a lot of questions about it as
Yes.
well. I think that's a space that you can really use to stand out, because it's not just about understanding a problem statement, but also to talk through what your solutions will be to that problem statement, and how well not only you've read about it, but how critically you're thinking about a problem and how to kind of solve it in a way that the solution really sticks.
Correct.
So I would encourage you to think very deeply about what you write in the innovation proposal. It's an opportunity to stand out.
Right, and these are the 3 documents, and then once you're selected, you're called for interviews, and we essentially do 2 kinds of interviews. One is a behavioral interview, and the other is a case-based interview. Disha, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that just generally across the interviews, what we're trying to check for, and it's a great opportunity not just for the organization to check for, what kind of a fellow you'll be and what kind of a team, you should be a part of, but also for you to check about the kind of situations that IIC teams normally go through, and what would that add to your experience if you're selected to be a part of the fellowship program.
Great. So thank you for tuning in. I think that's it for today. And if you have any questions, you can write to us at iic@uchicago.edu, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.